Okay. Okay. So hi everybody. My name is Igor Minar. I'm the team lead on the AngularJS project with Google, and I came to talk to you about AngularJS and how it can help you build awesome web applications. So everybody here knows what a web browser is, right? Yes? I see some giggles. Yeah. But if you look at the browsers, wasn't that far long ago when browsers looked something like this. They were very simple, and more importantly, the content that they used to display was very simple, static, quite frankly boring. So it's very exciting to look at the browsers today and see that they look something very different. We can do all of our mailing, calendaring, chatting, many of our social interactions, looking at photos, sharing them, all this stuff right there in the browser. And crazy as well, you can run a full-blown IDE in the browser. And that's amazing. Like, I wouldn't have thought that this would be possible, but today it is. So as a user, I feel very good about the current state of affairs. I feel like there are all these rich applications and all this content that I can use and share with my friends and just enjoy. But I can't say the same as a developer. And the reason for that is complexity, and complexity associated with building these very rich applications. And as you probably know, complexity kills. Complexity kills innovation, it kills creativity, and creates this huge barrier between you and the user you're trying to build this awesome application for. Well, what do I mean by this complexity? Let's have a look at this very simple application, and it's going to be implemented in HTML. I'm not sure if you guys in the back can see, but it's just a hello world in a p tag. Very simple HTML. And it's enough to tell the browser, hey browser, I want you to render a paragraph, and I want the content of this paragraph to be hello world. Now notice, you're not telling the browser how to do this. You're telling the browser what the end result should be, and it's up to the browser to figure out how to get this done. Now let's compare this to a JavaScript version of the same application. You probably cannot read this, but just think about all the events you have to listen on, all the DOM manipulation you have to do, and figure out all the browser inconsistencies and work around them. You know, IE is very different from everybody else, unfortunately. But the worst of all is that you're not telling the browser what the end result is. You're telling the browser, this is a sequence of steps I want you to execute. And as a side effect, not as the main goal, is the side effect will be that hello world will be displayed in the browser. When I used to build applications in this way, I felt like I was dealing with black magic. Like I was tricking the browser into doing things, and the browser was not really helping. It was just making things more difficult for me. Anybody remembers how we used to do rounded corners before we had border radius? All these nested divs and background images? Well, that's the kind of tricking of browser I mean. You were not telling the browser I want rounded corners. You were just doing all this craziness to get rounded corners. So while CSS has improved by a lot, and we can express our intentions in CSS much better than what we were able to in the past, I don't see the same kind of improvements being done in HTML and in DOM APIs. And you might want to say, hey, I'm a jQuery developer. I'm a jQuery ninja. Everything's good. Well, not really, because jQuery is imperative. This is the sequence of steps you take, and as a side effect, I'll have something. And if you think about this, jQuery would not exist if the browser APIs were sane and were implemented consistently. Like, jQuery only fills that gap of all the madness that we have to go through when we are trying to implement something on top of native APIs. So the solution I'm looking for is declarative. I want a declarative way of specifying how the application should look and how it should react to the user input. So something like we had the hello world in a static document, but I want the solution to work for applications, not for documents. So maybe something like double curly greeting in this case. So if you're familiar with WPF or Flex, then you know that I'm hinting data binding. Data binding is the answer. And data binding really solves many of these problems very elegantly. In data binding, you have a model, you bind that model to some template, and you let the templating engine to generate views. In this case, I'm generating two views. One is the model is bound to a form, and in the other view, the model is bound to just a profile view of this Tony Stark superhero. And the best thing about data binding is that when you interact with the model the views will update automatically for you. You don't need to tell the templating engine, go and update this field. It will just happen. And also, it works the other way around. If the user interacts with the input box, like in this case in the form, the model will be updated automatically, and those changes in the model will also be fed into the profile view, and that will update automatically for you. So what you get out of this is this spreadsheet-like updates. Like in spreadsheet, you create all these formulas and everything just recalculates. This is exactly what data binding will give you in a web application or in any application where data binding is being used. So that was a very simple use case. Let's take something more advanced where we have a collection of items. And in this case, I have 3 superheroes in an array, and I'm going to bind this to a template using a looping construct. And what I get out of that is the templating engine will see that there are 3 items in the collection, and it will generate a list of 3 superheroes. And the most important thing here is that as I interact with the model and change the model, all the changes will propagate to the view automatically for me. So I don't have to go back and somehow update the list once it's generated. So if I push a new superhero to the array, a new item will be added to the list. If I remove it, it will be removed. The templating engine will figure out how to take the template and stamp out as many copies necessary to iterate over the entire array. So data binding is very powerful, and you might be wondering, but this doesn't exist in the browser. What am I talking about here? Well, in Angular, we actually added data binding to HTML as a very natural extension to the HTML language. And it's available today in all browsers, including IE8 and mobile browsers, and we implemented it using JavaScript. We're also working with a group at Google because we think the data binding is so awesome that it should be baked into the native platform. And the group is in charge of creating a specification that they call model-driven views. Model-driven views is an attempt to bring data binding natively to the browser so that it's not implemented in JavaScript code. The browser just naturally understands by default what data binding is and how to do it. This is something that's going to take a while to implement and get all the vendors to agree on what it should look like and how it should be implemented. So you don't need to be wasting time, and you can start using data binding today with Angular. So while data binding is really good at removing a lot of the JavaScript boilerplate from the application, data binding is not going to help you with verbosity of HTML, because HTML can be verbose as well. Let's take a very simple example. I'm not sure if you can see this, but these are 3 tabs rendered using Twitter Bootstrap. Twitter Bootstrap is a CSS framework that gives you some components, and this is one of them. So in order for me to do this, I really like Twitter Bootstrap, but it forces me to take this chunk of HTML from their documentation and paste it into my application, and I paste it everywhere where I need tabs, and find all the places where I need to fill the content in, and just maintain this as my application grows or as Twitter Bootstrap changes. And this is really, again, feeling like I'm tricking the browser. What I want to say in my HTML template, I want to say, hey browser, I want you to render tabs. And I want the tabs to have 2 panes or 3 panes, and each pane should have some title and some content. Now, this is something that we call reusable components, and these components are possible to build with AngularJS. And it's not just tabs. Just think about all the use cases where this would be useful, where you could just create components that is reusable, and you can use it again in your project in some other places, or you can share it between 2 different projects in your organization, or just with developers at large, like the Twitter tabs. So that's something that people should just share. So these components, they can be very simple and stateless, or complicated and stateful. It's really up to you how you use them. The way we implemented them, we used the existing JavaScript and DOM APIs, and we got this working in all the browsers, including IE8, mobile browsers, and set-top boxes, and what have you. We're also working with a different group at Google that is building a specification called Web Components. And Web Components allows you to build reusable components just like I showed you with Angular, but this is implemented natively. And they are a lot. They bring many new features that we cannot implement using existing JavaScript APIs. If you are a hacker, you can actually download the latest builds of WebKit and Chrome, the nightly builds, and you can start playing with parts of the specification because that is already being implemented. So I showed you two features that Angular can that Angular can help you build applications with. One of them was data binding. The other one was reusable components. Angular offers many other things like routing and navigation. Helps you with persistence in your application. Another big thing is dependency injection and testability. Like we think that in order to build big applications, you need to be able to test them. And in order to get people to test, write tests, testing should be easy. So we thought a lot about how we can make testing easy. And there are many other things, but let's not waste time with slides. I'm just going to show you some coding demos. Now I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have, so just speak up and I'll try to answer as much as I can. In order, if you want to start with Angular, I suggest that you go to angularjs.org. We have a pretty good website with lots of examples and live examples that you can interact with. Some screencasts that show you how to build, how we built these examples. And our documentation is also quite extensive. All of the APIs are documented. We have many examples of how to use those examples and how you can interact with many of the you can interact with you can interact with examples and just see how they change. We also have a build with Angular, so if you're wondering who's using Angular, some of the biggest projects are DoubleClick. DoubleClick is a division of Google that does a lot of advertising and interaction with advertising agencies. So they built their entire new platform. The front end is built with AngularJS. So the front end that faces all the advertising agencies uses Angular, and that's a huge project that we've been involved in. We're helping with building for the past year and a half, and they just launched just recently. There are many other projects, and Lucas could actually mention a little bit of what they are doing with Angular here at WebFilings. Okay, can you see this? This is usable at all. Make it bigger. Is that better? The guys in the back, can you see this? Or do I need to still look at it? Okay. So I'm just going to show you how we build a simple to-do list, because to-do list seems to be very hot this year, and we thought that we would build our version of to-do list just to show people, how this is done in Angular. So what I have here is a static page, static HTML that includes Twitter Bootstrap for CSS and AngularJS and to-do.js. It's a file where all of our application logic will live. And I have a simple HTTP server running in the background that is just serving these files. There is no server-side anything going on. We're just serving static files to the browser, and all the magic will happen in the browser. And this is the browser in which I have the page. It just contains static HTML right now. So the HTML, we have a body, we have a simple heading here, we have a paragraph with some counters, and a static list of tasks. And down here we have a form that doesn't do anything right now. It's empty. So the first thing, how do we turn this static page into an Angular application? We really like to be declarative, so we thought it would be cool if we could just do that declaratively. And we created this ng-app attribute, which allows you to specify a module that should be loaded for this application. So I'm just going to say we're going to have to-do app, and I want it to be bootstrapped starting at this HTML element. Now Angular can coexist with existing applications. So if you're a legacy application and you want to you want to bootstrap Angular application within an existing application, you can do that just by moving this ng app somewhere down, say here, and this only this paragraph is going to be a small Angular application. And you can even have multiple Angular applications live side by side on one page if you want to. Okay, so I have application bootstrapped, and now I would like to say that this name should be dynamically generated. So you see that in the browser there's nothing right here. The reason why I have no username at all is that I haven't specified the model. So this data binding doesn't bind to anything. And just to show you what this page looks like without ng app, it's just going to show the double curlies because that's what the HTML template is. It's Angular translating, looking through the DOM, figuring out where all the bindings are, translating those to some values and removing the double curlies. I'll put this back. And in order for me to specify the model, the username model, I need a controller. And I'm just going to place it on this body tag. You can have multiple controllers in the application if you want to. We have routing, and I'll get to that later. And let's say I have a app controller. And now all of a sudden it works. And the reason why it works is because I already have some of the code in my to-do.js. Let's go over that. So in my to-do.js, I'm creating a new module called to-do app. And I'm taking this module and I'm specifying that in this module there's a controller called app controller, and I have this constructor function that defines how the controller is constructed. So the controller just takes one argument called $scope. And for now, just think of $scope as some context that is shared between the controller and the template. And by exposing the model on this context, you make it available to the templating engine. So what I can do is I can just say $scope.username and assign some string to it. So in this case, I have Igor. And what I get out of that is that Igor is put here in the heading. That's very simple, but let's tackle this list. You probably noticed already that I have a simple array of items defined here. So I have each item is an element in an array and has two properties, text and done. And by default, we have just two items. One is task 1, the other one is task 2. Let's go back to the HTML and see how we could convert the static list to a dynamically generated list. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy-paste that list, and I'm going to remove the last two because I don't really need them anymore. I need just a template for a simple list item. And what I'm going to say, I'm just going to say ng repeat equals item in items. Oops. And when I save, you see that now I have two lists. One is with 3 items, that is the statically generated one, and the other one is with 2 items, that's the dynamically generated one. If I remove this, let's get rid of that list, I can replace the task 1 with just item.text, where item is the current element in the array, and the text property comes from a model. This guy. And I could even display the current status. So you see that one of them is false and the other one is true. But the checkboxes are not reflecting this state, and we want to do that. And even if I check the checkbox, like nothing changes. The reason why it doesn't work is we haven't data bound the inputs to this model. So I'm going to use another special attribute called ngModel. I'm just going to say item.done. I'm actually going to leave this here. Okay, and now when I save this, you see that the second checkbox is checked. And if I click on it, this part actually refreshes automatically. So that's how I got the two-way data binding working with a model and the checkbox. Remove that. And the next thing I want to tackle is these counters. So array has a way of telling me what's the number of elements in the array. Anybody knows what's the property called? Length. Yeah. Thank you. So I can just say items.length. And because my model is just a native array, it has this property that it's just the browser gives me. And I can just data bind to it directly. And the end result is that now the second counter is working for me. How about this first one? Now, browser doesn't know anything about items and their status, so we need to create something custom, something domain specific. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a remaining method, which already works because it's implemented, and I'll show you the implementation of it. So in my controller, I have this remaining method, and its implementation is just a very simple function, which takes the items, the array, our model, and uses the reduce function, which is an ECMAScript 5 native method that allows us to iterate over an array. And every time we find an item that is done, we're going to increment the counter. That is not done, we're going to increment the counter. Otherwise, we're not going to increment the counter. And the result of calling this function is just a single number with the number of items that are not done yet. That works. How about this archive link? So what I would like to do is, whenever I have any items that are done already, and I click on this archive link, I want to go through the array and just get rid of them and create a new array that will not contain them. So what I can do is, can use another attribute, ng click, and just call archive. And this is another method that is implemented in our controller. And again, we're just using a filter method, which is an ECMAScript 5 method that was added just recently. And it's just going to iterate over the array, and it's going to look for items that are not done. And based on this, a new array is generated containing only those items that are not done. So by calling this filter method, we just generate a new item that contains only those items that are not done, and we're going to overwrite our item and scope .items with this new array.
Does Angular come with the polyfills?
No, it doesn't, and I don't think it should, because there are many other polyfills that do this really well. So if you want to be if you are using browsers that don't have this functionality, then there are already existing libraries that do this really well, and we don't want to solve all the problems, especially those that were already solved. So when I call the archive link, you see that the item disappears. But how about adding items to this array? So I have this form, and in a round-trip application, you would use it to generate a request to the server. The server would do something and would return a string of HTML that is then used to completely reload the page in the browser. But in a client-side application, you don't want to do a full-page reload. So we want to handle as much as possible on the client side. So what I can do here is I can use the engine model that I showed you before and data bind this input field to a new model. And I'm just going to call it new item, and specifically the text property of this new item. So now, if I bind to this new item and start typing here, you see that the page is just updating automatically for me because of the two-way data binding and this one-way data binding in the template. So I'm going to remove this one-way data binding, and I'm going to add a click handler. So again, ng-click. Oops. I'm going to call add method in our controller, and I'm going to pass in the new item that is bound to the form. And if we go to the controller, we see that the add method is implemented as a simple function which takes one object and creates a new item object out of that with the text property and the done property, where done property is set to false by default, and the text property is set to the text property of the new item. We're going to take this new item that we created, and we're going to push it to an array of items, just using the native push function, push method in JavaScript. And at the end, we're going to clear the text property of the new item so that the input box is emptied once I submit the form. So if I did everything properly, this should just work. New task. Yes. So you can notice that all of the counters, everything is just being recalculated as I interact with the application. So every time I archive something, the counters are just recalculated, and everything just happens for me. And all I have to do is declaratively specify what my application looks like, what kind of behavior there are, where my model is, and all of my business logic is implemented in the controller and doesn't do any kind of domain manipulation, and is completely presentation logic free. And this is very important when you're starting to build larger applications and you start to care about testability. Not having the presentation logic mixed with the business logic makes your controller or your business logic in general very testable. And you should also think about all the manipulation that we freed you from, because to get all this functionality, it's not a whole lot, but doing this with JavaScript, just think of all the listeners you would have to register, extend the array whenever there's something added, or shrink it. It would be a lot of code. So there are several issues with my application. One of them is if I hit enter when there's nothing in the input box, I have this empty tasks added, and I would like to prevent that. So what I can do is I can use another attribute that we have, ng disabled. And I can say, disable this button when the new item.text is empty. By empty, I'm just going to do negate it. So now you see that by default, the button is disabled. And if I start typing in it, it's enabled. And once I submit it, it's again disabled. Now, again, think about all the work you would have to do to get this kind of functionality, all the listeners you would have to register, all the manipulation you would have to do. And instead, in Angular, you can just declaratively specify, this is the behavior that I want, and you just figure out how to get it done. By now,
Space.
sorry?
You can still enter a space.
You could enter a space. So there are, actually, Angular is smart enough to not consider space as input. We're just going to trim it by default. There are ways to prevent that.
You have to say that.
No, it doesn't have to say. If you don't like this, you can tell Angular not to do it. But by default, we just thought it was sensible to just trim all the input.
So, I understand ng model to a point, but the new item is never declared in your input. Is that right? When you say ng model is new input, so how does that magic happen? Because I'm really curious about that, because it's never declared anywhere.
Right. So a new item is not declared anywhere except in our template. And what is happening behind the scenes, Angular will see that this input field is bound to a new item which doesn't exist. And as long as you don't interact with the input box, Angular will just ignore it. But as soon as you start interacting with the input field, Angular will see, oh, this is bound to this model that doesn't exist. And by default, the right thing to do is just to create a new object with that property text and assign the value from the input box to that text property.
Does it also go up to the scope chain then to determine that? So it does go to
yeah. So you can interact with the new item in the controller if you want to. It's just going to work.
Right. So that's kind of magical.
You could say that it's magical.
I like magic, don't you? But the first time I saw that, I was very confused. So.
Yeah. One thing we don't do, we don't. We want the model to drive the view and not the other way around. So if you, let's say in your template, you would say that the value of this input field by default is something, we will ignore that. And we will ignore that on purpose because that would put extra stuff into, it would put state into the template. And in order to initialize your application, you need both the template and the controller, which makes the application hard to test. So that's why if you work with Angular templates and controllers, it's always the controller driving the application and the view.
So is it pretty common then to use an object other than a strict property, such as a string? Instead of new item.text, obviously you're using that.
Yeah, you could use plain old strings. There are some corner cases when that is not going to do the right thing for you. But as I showed with the username, like the basic stuff works just fine. It's just I don't like to see it in more complex applications because then there are some extra things that you have to think about and it's not necessary. Okay, so we have the button working, and for whatever reason, I don't know, I have a COBOL backend and I can only store items with 15 characters, 15 characters long and nothing longer. So I need to restrict the input. And in HTML, you can do this using max length. And I'm just going to specify 15. And now if I say do something really awesome, I can't even finish because unfortunately this is how HTML works. So if you say max length is 15 characters, then 15 is all you can do. So we thought that the behavior that you see in most of the modern applications where the user is allowed to finish the sentence and then go back and edit it, like in many of the Twitter clients, is much better. So if I replace max length with ng max length and just say do something really awesome, we're going to start validating the input field as soon as we see ng max length property on that input field. And when the validation constraint is violated, we're going to flag this input box as invalid. And the way we do that is through CSS classes. So then in your CSS of your application, you can use this CSS in the DOM to highlight any kind of invalid state. And what we are doing in our application, I just have a simple rule that says if you come across an input field that has a ng invalid class on it, just render it with a red border around it. So now, of course, if I go back and delete something so that the input is shorter than 15 characters, the validation is working properly and the constraint is not violated, and the the class just goes away and the border is not rendered anymore. But this works well, but we're not really telling the user what the problem is. And to do that, we want to display a message. So what I can do is I can just create a new div, and I can say input too long. But unfortunately, the message is going to be displayed all the time, so I just want to conditionally display it when the input is invalid. So what I can do is we have another special attribute called ng_show. And ng_show takes an expression. And if that expression is true, then it's going to show make visible this entire div. If it's false, then it's going to hide it. So what I want to data bind to is the model, the form validation model of this form. And in order to do that, I need to name this form something. So I'm just going to call it name new item form, and I'm going to call the input field new item. And then in show, I can just say new item form dot new item, and the validation model is a map we call $error, and I can specifically say show this when the max length constraint is violated. So now I can say do something really long. And we see that the message is displayed. And again, when I go back and delete some of the input, it just disappears. Now, I hope that you are starting to wonder what all these ng things that I'm using here. These special attributes, we call them directives. And it's a way how our templating in Angular works. We just take the HTML, we sprinkle it with these extra tags, and those tags give meaning to the application, and the template compiler understands what these attributes mean, and can just provide us with all this behavior. You might be wondering if I'm making the template invalid by adding all these extra tags. That is true. If you care about validness of the template, you can just prefix all of the attributes with data dash, and it's just going to work. If you are using XHTML, you can use ng column, and that's going to work too. This actually allows you to data bind to SVG, and there are some people who are using Angular with SVG to do some diagramming tools and that kind of stuff. But I like, and many Angular users, they just like ng dash because it's short. The reason why we use ng dash is we want to distinguish our magical stuff from the native HTML. But more importantly, we allow you to use the same APIs we use to build all of these directives. So you can build your own. If whatever Angular has is not cutting it for you, if you want, I don't know, something that Angular doesn't contain out of the box, you can create your own directive, your own custom attribute, specify what it means and what kind of DOM transformation or some kind of business logic should happen whenever the compiler comes across this construct. And we ask you to prefix this directive with your own custom prefix, so whatever is specific to your application. We use ng as Angular, so that's what we do. Okay, so we have a very simple application, but when I refresh the page, you'll see that everything goes away. The reason why it goes away is there is no persistence in my application. So how about we add persistence? And I'm actually going to cheat a little bit. I implemented this already, and I'm just going to skip to a commit in Git that has this implemented. I'm just going to walk you through all the changes that I made to implement persistence in my application. So as you see, the application refreshed, and now I have 4 tasks. I'm actually talking to MongoLab database. MongoLab is MongoDB in the cloud with a REST interface in front of it. So when my application starts, I'm making a GET request to fetch all of the items in my to-do list, and then I'm going to display them. And when I'm going to add new items, I'm going to make a POST request to MongoLab to store that. And the same thing happens. I'm going to make a PUT request when I check or uncheck any of the items. So, persistence. Before, we had the items as an array in our controller. It was just a simple in-memory storage, and that's why it went away. What I want to do now is I actually want to say that there is a component that is in charge of making all the persistence and persistence calls and all the REST calls, and I'm just going to call it item. So that's my business model. And in order for me to fetch all of the items from MongoLab, I'm just going to call item.query. So item, think of it as a RESTful client that has a query method, save method, delete method, and everything you would expect from a RESTful client. And by doing a query, I'm just making a request to MongoLab, and whatever is returned is then assigned to $scope items, so that it's available in templating, and also to local items variable, so that I can just refer to it very easily within the same controller. Now, one thing you might start wondering about is this single line, specifically this part of it. What is strange about this? on making a request to the server. That's a hint. Sorry? Synchronous, yeah. It looks like it's synchronous, but it's not. When this line executes, it will return immediately, but what is returned out of the query is a placeholder. It's a future or promise object that will eventually be filled with all the data that comes from the server. But by exposing this object and making it available to data binding, the data binding will just start observing this model, and when the data comes, we're just going to fill this bucket, this object with the data that is returned from the server, and the data binding will see it and will render all the LIs and just render as many as necessary and data bind everything properly.
And if I've added items on the page in the meantime, while that's happening, what happens?
If you add it, that is going to make a safe, that is going to make a pull request to the server, and you might run into, this is a very simple application, so you might run into a situation where you lose data. You would want to do something more sophisticated in that case, but that's possible too.
If a listener on the query comes back to it.
You can, exactly. So you can add, this query actually takes 2 arguments optionally, which is the success callback and the error callback. So if you want to do some kind of custom logic, usually you see this in more complex applications, you definitely want to do something. You can provide the callbacks, but in simple cases it's not necessary.
What about just showing loading or something?
You can do that too. There are ways how you can intercept. You can hook into the persistence layer and the entire HTTP communication with the server, and you get notified of any kind of pending requests, so you know when there are pending requests in the application when they are not. So you can create this kind of feature without tying it to a specific controller. So, but that was the query, and then I also have a $save, so when we are adding stuff, everything remains the same, except I'm calling new item, so I'm just going to construct new item, which will create a very simple model which has a $save that allows me to save and persist data to the server. And when I'm deleting, I have the same similar functionality, $remove to remove stuff from the server. So you must be wondering about this item and where it came from. And I'm going to show you that I can actually rearrange the arguments in my controller, and my application will still work. If I refresh it, it still works. The reason why it works is in Angular we have dependency injection. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with dependency injection. Anybody comes from Java? 1, 2, 3, couple of hands. Okay. So in Java is, I used to be a Java programmer, and one of the few things I liked about Java was the dependency injection, because that was a very, very powerful feature that was implemented through different libraries. Juice is probably the most famous one. And what dependency injection allows you to do is remove dependency resolution and instance creation from your application. And you can just declaratively specify all the dependencies between individual components in your application, and you specify how these components should be instantiated. And it's up to the dependency injector to figure out all these dependencies and instantiate all of the components in the right order at the right time. This means that your application is better structured. You have smaller components in your application that you can work with. And at testing time, when you're writing tests, you can actually completely rewire your application and mock out pieces that are hard to test with. For example, in my case, in my application, calling in this controller, I would be making the request to the server. And I don't want to do that in a unit test, because that would make my unit test slow, and I would need to have a server available during unit test run. So I just want to provide a fake implementation of this persistence layer that my test will run against. So in Angular, we added this dependency injection, and the way it works, we actually look at the argument names of functions that are dependency injected, and look at the registry of all the instances that we already instantiated. If we have an instance of this particular service, we will just provide it to the controller when it's instantiated. If we don't have it, then we have a definition of how to build the instance, and we're going to create an instance. So when we look at the definitions of this item, we see that it's down here, and it's the definition of the item is specified through a factory function. Factory function is just a very simple function that has its own dependencies, and when it's called, it returns an object, and this object is the instance that should then be injected into all the other pieces of the application that ask for this dependency. So we can see that this factory function is asking for $resource and API key, where $resource is a built-in service in Angular, and it's a RESTful client generator. So it's a service that allows you to generate RESTful clients. And API key is a application-specific service that is actually, it's a constant that is used to authenticate ourselves against the Mongo app database. So we can just say a to-do app has a constant called API key, and the API key is this particular value. And then in our item factory, we can just ask for the API key. This also means that at deploy time, you can provide different keys depending on what the environment is. So if you have like a staging environment, you would just provide a different key very easily. The rest of this factory function is not very interesting. I'm just calling resource, providing a template URL based on which the RESTful client is going to be generated. And I'm just customizing it for the use in this application and for the use with MongoLab APIs. But at the end, I'm going to return an item, which is an object that is then injected into the app controller. And I can just use it. So I mentioned testing a little bit, and I'm going to show you some of the testing that we do with Angular. So in Angular applications, it looks like there's a lot of magic going on, and actually, if you start digging deeper, you'll understand how things work and how that whole dependency injection works, how the templating works. So there isn't that much magic. It's just very well thought through system of removing boilerplate, removing global state from the application, and more importantly, also making the application testable. So how many of you don't know about Jasmine and Jasmine BDD framework for writing tests? 1, 2 hands? Sorry?
I saw it in the tutorial.
You saw it in the tutorial? Really? Just 3 people? How many people do testing here? I'm not, okay. What kind of testing? Unit testing or the full-blown API testing? What do you use for unit testing? JS tester with Jasmine, okay. Jasmine with HTML runner. Anybody uses QUnit, or there are many other flavors of this? JUnit.
Dope.
Okay, so Jasmine is a assertion framework and a runner that allows you to build test suites, more specifically the unit test suites. And what you would see is they use this behavior-driven style of writing tests, or rather specifications for your application. So what you can do is, with Jasmine, you can say, let's describe this app controller. We have some before each, something that should be executed before each of the specs. And we can actually have nested describe. So we're going to describe specifically the add method. And there are 2 specifications for this add method. One is that it should add a new task to the array, and the other one is it should reset the text in a model, so that when I hit the submit button, the add button, the input box is cleared. So one thing I really like about Jasmine is that it makes my tests readable. Once you get into it, writing tests is not that difficult, especially if you have the right tools. But maintaining them and being able to debug stuff can be difficult. Jasmine allows you to write this very easy to read annotations, and it has a very nice API that makes reading tests and maintaining them easier than other solutions that I've seen. And we suggest that you use Jasmine when you build Angular applications. You don't have to, but we give you some helper methods and make it even easier with Jasmine. So if you look at this very simple test, what we are doing is we take the scope, the context, and we're just asking what is the length of the items array, and we expect it to be 0, because at the beginning of a test, it should be empty. Then we're going to call the add method, which is the method we are testing, and we're going to pass in a new object, text with a text fake task, so some fake model. And once this is executed, we expect the items array to contain 1 item, so its length should be 1, and the text property of this first item should be fake task. Very simple test, but this is very common for Angular applications. Once you separate presentation logic from the business logic, business logic itself, especially when it's implemented just with JavaScript, it's very easy to test. And as you saw in the controller, you don't really call Angular APIs in the controller. It's really up to you how complicated the controller will be and how clean it will be. Like, you're not forced to be calling some Angular APIs. Or if you look at like Backbone or Ember applications, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Backbone and all these other solutions. Nobody? Few hands, okay. So with all these other solutions, you have to wrap your model into a wrapper and access it through getters and setters, which means that your entire application is now tied to Ember or Backbone or whatever you're using. And these getters and setters also make it harder to interoperate with third-party libraries, because these third-party libraries usually don't know anything about accessing all these objects through getters and setters. They just know how to work with plain old objects. There are many other reasons why we think that the approach with wrappers is wrong, and there are better ways to do it. So if you look at the second test, it's again super simple. It's just, does the new item even exist? It shouldn't, because as somebody asked, it wasn't defined anywhere. But then once we define it and we call the add method, we should have the new item.text should be empty string. So it's, again, a very simple test. So writing tests is easy, reading them is easy. How about running them? If you use Jasmine and if you use the default way of running tests, it's all about using HTML file which contains all the scripts. It loads them in the right order, and then you see the HTML-based runner just go through the test and show you green or red or any kind of errors. And in order to rerun the test, you have to refresh the page. So what that means is that you have to have a tab in the browser open with this URL of this file. And as you change the source code or the test file, you have to switch back to the browser, refresh the page, and now wait for it to tell you that something failed. So we thought that there is a better way to do this, and that's why we wrote a JavaScript test runner, which we call Testacular. It's our spectacular test runner, and it's a node-based server which doesn't know anything about tests, doesn't know anything about assertions. The only thing it knows is how to grab a bunch of JavaScript files, execute them in any kind of browser, and get the results back and show them in a terminal or whatever you use to invoke the test. So what I'm going to show you now is I have in Web Store, I just have a simple shortcut to start Testacular. And let me just start it. Let's do this. Seems that I have another. Okay, so the Testacular server started, and it asked me to point some kind of browser to localhost 8081. I'm going to go there, and it's going to tell me that this browser is now captured. What that means is there is a communication channel created between the browser and the Stackler server. And now the Stackler server can dispatch commands to the browser and have the browser execute them. This is implemented through WebSockets, so it's really fast and really stable on modern browsers. If you happen to use IE and run tests in IE, we definitely support that, and there's a fallback solution for that. So by starting the server, I provided a configuration file, which I'm not going to show you right now. But the configuration file is very simple and just contains definition of, this is my project, this is where all the source files and test files are. And as soon as the Stackler starts, it can start watching the file system. And when I change anything in my file system, let's say I remove, comment this out, it's going to run. I don't know if I cannot make it bigger. I'm sorry. It's just going to run all the tests on my file system, and it's going to tell me if there's anything that failed. Let's see what the output looks like. So it's just going to tell me that there is a one test failing for app controller add. It should add new task, and it expected the length of the array to be 1, but it was 0. And I get the stack trace, and WebStorm is awesome enough to make it clickable so that I can click actually and go to the line that failed, and I can just fix this. And as soon as I uncomment that line, the Stackler will see the file system change. It will dispatch a test run to the browser and will notify me that it's now succeeding. So I'm going to have success here. There are some other nice features, like if I want to run just certain tests, I can mark test specs with it instead of it, and it's just going to execute only these tests. You can also do the same thing with describe by changing to just the describe. So this really makes the whole testing experience very easy because you stay in your IDE or editor, whatever you have. The Stackler is not tied to WebStorm. You can just use it with Vim or Sublime or whatever you have. You can run it on the CI server, so you can reuse the same configuration on the same setup and run the test suite on the CI server, and it's just going to work. Another awesome thing is that when you have multiple browsers, you can just take another browser and just point it to 8081. Now, in this case, I have Safari, so I have Chrome and Safari captured. And again, as soon as I rerun some tests, let me make something fail so that it's more fun. So it's going to tell me that it executed tests in Chrome, and it executed 7 out of 7 tests, and 1 failed. And again, I have stack traces to figure out what is it that failed. So you can use this with mobile browsers as well. If you have an iPhone, it's very nice to debug applications in this way. And I often use it with IE because debugging IE really sucks. So what I do, the Stackler allows you to dump output of any kind of variable. So let's say I take this item.text, but you can think of this being some kind of DOM property, and you can just rerun the test, and then it's going to tell you that in Safari it's remove me, and then Chrome it's again remove me. But if it was DOM and if it was IE, it would probably be something you would not expect it to be. So I like to use this for debugging as well. We think a lot about end-to-end testing as well. We have our own end-to-end test runner, which allows it to write end-to-end tests as well, but I'm not going to go into that. Let me show you some other stuff. But again, I'm happy to take questions, so just ask.
So, is Spectacular out right now?
Yeah.
So that replaces that Ruby file, that tails the log file?
Yes.
Okay.
So
That's-
if you're familiar with Angular Seed and the tutorial, we were using Watcher and JS driver to run the test. JS driver, we really like the idea of it, but the implementation is just not as good as we would like it to be. It's just too flaky to be used all day long. We want a test runner that just can, you start it on Monday and you shut it down on Friday, just going to work. And Spectacular is it. So, yeah. Yeah, the reason why the tutorial in Angular C doesn't have Spectacular yet is that we are finishing implementation of an end-to-end test proxy, so we can run our end-to-end test with Spectacular, and then we can completely remove just the driver from the tutorial on Angular C. Okay. Other questions? Go ahead.
Does Spectacular work with QUnit or is it just Jasmine?
We provide an adapter for Jasmine, but it's very easy to create adapters for anything. So you can write a simple adapter for QUnit and like Spectacular knows nothing about the assertion framework that it's being used with. So, and that's by design, because many of the other solutions they combine the assertion framework with the runner, and I don't think that's the right way to do it. Because those are two very different concerns. There was another question?
You can't Spectacular to Jenkins or other CI stuff.
Yeah.
And when you attach a node to the
You can use blanking on the name, PhantomJS with the Spectacular if you want to. We found that in practice it doesn't really make a lot of sense to do that for two reasons. One is your application is not going to run in PhantomJS, it's going to run in a real browser. So you want to run your tests in a real browser because there are differences between browsers. And the other one is people claim that PhantomJS is so much faster than real browsers. But with Angular Test Suite, we found that PhantomJS is actually slower than current version of Safari. So it doesn't really make sense to use PhantomJS if you have a runner of Spectacular. You can use it, but I just don't think that it applies too much.
Yeah, people at cost to Node.js server, browsing a server integration with sharing models.
So you're talking about the server-side use of Angular application, or
Either that or just sharing model control with customers.
sharing model?
Let's say you had a model that was used both server and console.
Okay.
How would you recommend this? Or maybe you have
Right. Like you can use Jasmine Node or one of those runners, and just execute the Jasmine Test Suite on the Node server. Like again, unless you're doing DOM manipulation, and plain old Node.js will just be sufficient for test and test code. Any other questions?
So I guess maybe this is a dumb question, but so would you say that an Angular app is ideal for a situation where you don't necessarily care or want your content to be indexed by a search engine?
So search engine optimization, like people ask me about this all the time. this is a common problem for all the client-side frameworks or libraries. And anytime when you're building a very rich client-side application, the search optimization is going to be an issue. I've seen some very creative solutions. None of them is perfect. One of them is Google has the crawling agent application specification, which allows you to use the hash banks and then point the crawler to an alternative presentation of a particular URL, which is crawlable. That's what we use for docs and AngularJS, and that's how we get those indexed. HBO is building their new web presence on top of it using Angular, and what they did, they ship pre-rendered templates to the client, to the browser, and then as the application is being bootstrapped, it just goes through the DOM and pulls the data out of the HTML, populates the model, and then kicks in the data binding to just get the client-side interactivity. I don't think that any of this is ideal. I think that there are two solutions that are the right solutions. One is either the crawlers should get smarter and be able to crawl and index the client-side application or the pages that were built up or DOM that was built up using DOM manipulation. Or all these client-side solutions need to have a pre-rendering story. And that's something that we are exploring right now. We're actually building a prototype where an Angular application is used in Bootstrap on the server side. We take the model, create a string out of it, we send it to the browser, and then once it's loaded in the browser, then we try to reattach to it and bootstrap all the bindings and all that stuff. It's going to take a while to get this done because it's a non-trivial task, but it's something we have interest in. We are actively exploring that.
Yeah, hopefully it'll eventually get there, but we might have to pull at Twitter and just do static pages for now.
So I was actually surprised by what Twitter did. I don't know if you guys know, but Twitter went from a round-trip application to a full-blown client-side application with hashbang URLs. And then a couple months later, they realized that makes the application slow, so they went back to a full-blown round-trip application. And now they think that that's not ideal, and they want to go back to somewhere in between. So they want to have the server-side pre-rendering and the client-side interactivity.
But they don't want Google to search them. I thought they could care less
They don't
about
care
it.
about indexing. And there are many applications that don't care about indexing. Like many of the applications, I would say actually most of the applications that are built with Angular are not meant for being indexed and crawled because they are either internal applications that are behind the firewall or
they're behind a page, like you got to log in the first place.
Or yeah, you have
and if you have a login, even a to-do app needs to have a place to store the data and a name to go with it.
Most of the applications are not indexable, not meant to be indexable. But what they are after is performance, because the way they implemented the client-side application, which was very unfortunate, they used hashbang URLs, which is using the hash in the URL string to specify the route path in the application. And what that means that in order for them to render anything like a simple tweet, they have to load all of the JavaScript, bootstrap the entire application, look at the hash, and then make a request to the server to fetch the data and show the data to the user. The hash is not sent to the server, so the server cannot pre-optimize this in any way and send the data with the initial request. And that was the problem. So if they were using HTML5 push state and pop state to use proper URLs, we could have done something better and send the data with the first request, and that would solve most of the problems they were having. But you know, now it's a big company with big infrastructure, so they must have had a good reason why they did this. But it kind of sounds silly to go back and forth.
It's an experiment, man. They're a startup.
But you know, now at least they have the URL. The proper URLs that will allow them to use push state to just add the client-side application to the application. So they are on the right path. It's just taking more hops back and forth than I would expect them to take.
They started out with Ruby, man.
I think they still use Ruby in some parts of the infrastructure. But we were talking about routing, and I have some examples of how you can do that in Angular. So, kill this. Okay, so the to-do application is very simple, and typically when you build larger applications, like DoubleClick, they have many, many views, and each view has its own URL, its own state, and there is some common menu on the page, the header and footer are common, but the middle page, middle of the application is changing depending on which view we are currently in. So Angular has a concept of routing, and I implemented this just with a very simple case here, where I have two links, my very simple menu. When I click on To Do, I see the To Do application that we built. And when I click on Hello, I just see Hello there. And if you look at the application code, all I had to do to implement this is in my To Do app module, just specify that I want to provide some kind of configuration. And in order to provide this configuration, I need route provider because we're going to configure routes. So this is something that's, again, injected through dependency injection. And route provider has an API to specify when there is a slash in the URL bar, address bar in the browser. I want the Angular to instantiate app controller and to fetch this to-do.html template, where to-do.html is all the code that I had in index.html before, and I just moved it to the separate file. HTML. So it's all of the code that we saw before, just in a separate file. And I have a second route, which is /hello, and it's just loading one template.html, and that file just contains hello there in the heading.
What's the name of that file?
Hello.html?
No, the one that contains the routes.
Oh, it's the to-do.js. It's the file where the controller, like I have everything in one file. In a typical Angular application, you would typically split the entire JavaScript code into one file per component. So we have like one file per controller, one file per service, and one file for this configuration. But this is very simple, and just for demonstration purposes, it's easier to just have everything in one file.
So does I mean, when you go to /hello, how does it know to load the to-do in the first place? Like if you go directly to /hello.
Okay. So the way it works is we go to this URL where /hello, the application will bootstrap. We'll look at the location and we'll see that, oh, the current URL is /hello. It will look at the route configuration. We'll see we have two routes defined. One for just slash, the other one for /hello. And because /hello matches the current URL in the browser, then this route will be matched, and this template will be loaded. And if we go to index.html, we have this ng view, which is like a hole in the main template. And this is where the contents of all this view-specific the view-specific template is included here and compiled and data bound. So in my index.html, all I have is the usual header, the ng app to bootstrap the application, and then I have a very simple menu that I created using just links. So the links just point to the hash slash and hash /hello. The browser already knows how to navigate between links and how to update the location. So Angular just has to watch the location, and when the location changes, it needs to try to match the current URL against the defined routes, and then pull all the templates either from cache or from the server, and instantiate controller and is defined, and then place the created view in between the ng view tags.
So this is using the hash thing, like it's not actually going to /hello on the server.
Exactly.
I just can't see the hash in there. So you could just replace that with hash bang if you wanted to use the hash bang way, right?
Yeah. So you can. You need to go back to the configuration, and you need to say that yeah, I need location provider, and you need to say that. Is this path prefix or?
Use HTML5.
So yeah, if you want to use the HTML5, if you want to use the URLs without hashbang, then you just need to say HTML5 mode is true. if you want to use the hash bang, then you need to specify the prefix, and I'm blanking on the name, but it's something like URL prop prefix, and you just specify that hash there. And Angular will just know that the URL contains that bang and just needs to strip it when it's matching those routes.
If you use
So-
HTML5 mode, does it fall back?
Exactly. So that's one of the things we figured out is if you're using a browser that doesn't support the HTML5 APIs, then we fall back to an implementation that uses hashbang URLs and can actually convert between the HTML5 URLs to hashbang URLs transparently. So even if you have like people that use the same application, one is using IE, the other one is using something better, then if on this URL and just post it through IM, it's just going to work even in different browsers. So that's something we figured out. We definitely recommend using the HTML5 mode where the push state and pop state are being used because it gives you it gives you many advantages, and one of them is if you need to do redirection, you can do it on the server side. You don't need to send the redirection rules with your entire application every time users will load it. The other one is you can do some kind of performance optimization. So because the server will get the entire URL, you know what data might be necessary to render the particular view, and you can ship it with the first request. So it gives you a lot more flexibility, and the modern applications are definitely suggest that you use that from the beginning.
You already plan to support radio instructions for that.
We don't have that on the short-term roadmap, but I don't see why that wouldn't be possible. We have some matching. It doesn't. This application is not good to demonstrate that, but I can say you can specify routes with like wildcard placeholders. So it will actually, this route will match hello/anything, where the anything will be extracted from the URL and made available to your application as a parameter that you can just later use in the application. But the true regular expression matching is not supported right now, but it could be. Send a pull request.
There's a solution for everything now.
Yeah. So yeah, I showed you a whole bunch of stuff. I showed you, the data binding. I showed you routing, persistence. How do we test, and how serious we are about testing. I showed you a little bit of dependency injection. Now I understand that this is a lot of stuff to just get it in one sitting. So I encourage you to just go back to AngularJS. We have a really good tutorial which you can go through and at your own pace. Just go through most of the stuff, and even more actually than what I showed you today. And go to a mailing list if you have questions. There are many people, including Lucas and all of his colleagues, that are eager to help and provide answers. Yeah, and if you have questions, happy to answer more. Yeah.
Where do like HTML snippets or templates exist? Like, would you make a request to the server to get some more HTML, or would it be like embedded in JavaScript?
It depends on the application. So especially when you're creating the custom directives, that's something I didn't show, and actually I wonder if I could show it now. Let me do some magic with my Git, and maybe I can show you something else. Okay, I have a different version of this application, and this version actually contains all widgets. We thought it would be cool if you could assign tasks to some minions or helpers. And so the form now contains a list of people that you can assign tasks to, and then that a widget with that person is going to be displayed next to the task. And the way we implemented this is using the directive. in my HTML, if I go, okay, in my HTML, I created this new avatar element, and I data bound it to item.minion, because my model now contains for each item not only text and done, but also minion. And minion is just the username of the person that the task was assigned to. So I'm going to grab this username, and I'm going to feed it into this custom component, and that will render this kind of widget. And if you look at the implementation of that, in our to-do-app module, we're specifying a directive. The directive is called avatar. Then we have a bunch of configuration options that say how this can be used. It means it can be used as an element, so we're creating a custom element. Down here is a template. In this case, the template, this is what actually is used to render this widget. In this case, the template is in the JavaScript. This is suboptimal. It's like good for toy applications, but you don't want to build big applications with big chunks of HTML in your JavaScript. So we actually allow you to just specify a URL that will be used to fetch the template from. And then when the application is bootstrapped and when the widget is needed, we will fetch the template, the little snippet. This is good for development because you can just change the file and refresh and you just see the change. But it's not good for deployment because you don't want to have an application that makes 500 requests to the server when it starts. So what we allow you to do is to have a deployment step where all of these little snippets are combined into one file, and which is then used to populate the template cache in one go. So in one request, you can feed the template cache. And then whenever we come across the avatar element, we'll just pull the template from the template cache and everything's good. But during development, it's probably better to just fetch it from, make a single request and make the application a little bit slower during development, but have still this rapid feedback and be able to just refresh in the browser and see the changes.
Last time I used a template language like this was Adobe Sprite, and every time you loaded the page, the first thing you saw was brackets, everything across the page.
What was the template language?
Adobe Sprite.
Adobe.
It's old school.
Okay.
So when you first load this, I know it's happening faster because it's just HTML page, but if you had other things that were rendering, are you going to see bracket username?
You're going to see curly if that's what the template contains. So like I showed you in this HTML, if I remove the ng app, and if I refresh this, this is the raw template. So this particular application, if the network connection is slow, or until the application is bootstrapped, this is what the user will see. And you definitely don't want to show this to the user. So there are several ways how you can deal with this. One of them is we have an ngcloak directive, an ngcloak attribute, which makes any element on which ngcloak is placed invisible by default through CSS. And once the template is compiled, then we make that element visible. So that's one way to do it. The other way is not use double curlies, but instead use the alternative syntax, which is ngbind attribute. So if you have a div, or in this case the heading, I could just say, where is it? So instead of this, I could say span ngbind equals username. And
Close the span.
I need to. So it works, and now it's not gonna.
You put the apostrophe S inside the span.
Yeah. So now you see double curlies everywhere, but because it's a span with attribute, the span is not rendered as anything because it has no content. And you can use this if you look at Build with Angular. It's one of the pages where we try to show you how you can get the first the loading experience to be as good as possible. So there is very little flicker on the page, even though we are fetching data from the server, and the templating is happening on the client side. So there are different ways how you can prevent the kind of behavior you saw in this other framework or library. Especially if you start using the routing and you have most of your templates in this view templates in these separate files. Those files are first compiled and only then added to the DOM, so you don't see any of the double curlies there. And what we see is that in big applications like in DoubleClick, they avoid the use of double curlies in the index.html in the main page. They use ngbind everywhere. And in all of the view-specific templates, they just use double curlies because that's not displayed. That's how they solve that in DoubleClick.
Is there any way to add any visual sugar to once it's there, show, make it animate in or anything?
You can.
You got to do callbacks or something.
Animate to what?
So like the first time you load that app, whenever
you can do that. Like it's HTML.
Well, I'm saying if you have it with the ng cloak or you're hiding it, like when it first loads, after it loads, you want it to.
Right. So one thing you can do is.
So just do it through CS. Okay.
It looks fancy in a browser.
Yeah. So another thing you can take the span that I created. Oops. You can take the span with the username and just put loading or whatever. And this is not the best use case in this scenario. But as soon as the application is bootstrapped and we know what this username is, then the loading will be replaced with the actual value. But I mean, you don't want to do this, but just to give you an idea of the flexibility you have. Do you have other questions?
How do you coordinate action between different components? So you have like a picture editor and the work area and palette, right? So maybe you want to be able to use for maybe a photo script at the bottom, especially like a photo script, you want to be able to reuse that in various applications. So is there an event messaging model? Or
typically, the data binding will solve for most of the problems where you would otherwise use event bus. There are a few scenarios where you would use events, even in Angular applications, and we have a built-in event system. So it's easy to broadcast events throughout the entire application and listen on them. We even take care of garbage collection and deregistration of these listeners, so you don't have to worry about deregistering the listeners. But in most of the cases, whenever I see people try to use events in Angular application, they're not thinking right about the problem, and they're not thinking about how I could use data binding to solve the same use case.
Is that because you can have a shared DI context and project the appropriate models?
Yes. You can create one component, a singleton in your application, that represents the model, photo strip in your case, or whatever you have. It can have like a selected item as one of the properties, and then any of the other components in your application can just inject that model to that component and just observe whatever is currently selected and respond to the changes. So the data binding, I didn't show you how you can listen to. So in my controller, for now, most of the code I showed was data binding in the template, but you can observe the changes to your model through the controller as well. So you can just say, this is a simple one. So scope dot watch username. So through this $watch API, what I can do is I can say start watching this path in my application, and when the resulting value of evaluating this path changes, let me know and provide me with the new value and the old value. So in your controller or in your service or whatever other components you might have, you can start observing the model and be notified when it changes. Another thing that I didn't show is I mentioned that this is a path. It's not a string or anything like that. it's actually more than path. It's an expression that we evaluate. And in the HTML, I'm going to make a real mess out of this code. Okay, this works. So in this case, I have a username, and I can actually concatenate stuff here. So I can say plus foo, and it's going to take Igor and attach foo to it. You can do simple math operations if you really have to. Like this is something you would use in Fire applications, or usually you would try to move this stuff to the controller and not have it in a template. We have also filters, so you can have a username, and one of the built-in filters is uppercase. So I can take the model, run it through some transformation function, and take the output of that and insert that into the DOM. So do that. There's a bunch of other stuff.
Can you handle the apostrophe S thing a little bit more elegantly than?
You could build a filter that would do that. You could say apostrophize or whatever.
Apostrophize.
Yeah.
Great language we have, English.
Right. And create this custom filter, and depending on the ending of the input, you would just do just that apostrophe or apostrophe S or whatever you want, or nothing at all if the model is empty.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with everything we did in Angular, we tried to stay as close to the native APIs and make it feel like you're dealing with browser in HTML and JavaScript, and pretend to be like this polyfill. And the side effect of that is that Angular, and working with Angular is very simple. Like we have people that come to us and say that, I don't know much JavaScript, but I was able to build this application. I'm like, oh, that's real awesome. When you the origins of Angular are actually in a tool that was targeting designers rather than developers, and was aimed to enable designers to build applications. We figured out that it was kind of hard to target this group because they don't really understand how to build applications, and yeah, they know HTML, they know CSS, but they don't really think in terms of application flow and persistence and database schema and all this stuff. So even if you make it very simple, it's still too complicated for them. Except for some cases, like I've seen designers that were able to build really nice prototypes with Angular. But more importantly, when we look at the code, this is simple. I would like to be able to build complex applications with something as simple as this. That happened like 2 years ago, and for the past 2 years we were trying to turn this designer-oriented tool to something that would be useful for building web applications and make it like a general-purpose web framework. Simplicity is one of the core philosophies behind the framework. Like we want to provide powerful features, but the APIs should be as simple as possible and non-intrusive. And people like it a lot. The way we actually observed the model mutation, because we are not using any kind of wrappers, we don't know when you change a model to something else. So we have this really sophisticated dirt checking algorithm inside of Angular that knows when and what to check to make it performant. But while this works even for large applications like DoubleClick, dirt checking is not the most efficient way to do things. And model mutation observation is something that is shared across any kind of library or framework that is trying to do data binding. So one of our goals is to take as much as we can from Angular that is shared with all the other libraries, and talk to the Chrome team, talk to the Safari team, and all these browser vendors, and make the browser smarter so that everybody can benefit from these features that are commonly being implemented in JavaScript right now. And that will be not only we'll have common primitives that are compatible between browsers, hopefully, but also it's going to be more performant and it's going to be tooling around that is going to be better, documentation is going to be better, so everybody's going to benefit.
So along those same lines, I know that this is probably the one hook that you kind of have to deal with is getting third-party libraries to work with your models and scopes and everything like that. And that is a little bit difficult at times. Is it going to be a community-wide effort until we get some kind of browser to watch the model view and stuff? I mean, because really we're dealing, I mean, that's the hard part is getting those shims in there. It's not easy necessarily. jQuery has added in, you know, but we can obviously add in the rest of it. But there are other classes out there that's just, it's really hard for you to get into that model scope.
Right. So interoperability with other libraries, Angular has to be a really good citizen, and that's why I answered the question about shims if we include shims. Like we try not to when the shims exist outside of Angular. Integrating with other components can be easy or difficult depending on how good of a citizen this third-party component is. So with many jQuery components in jQuery UI widgets, sometimes it's trivial because these components were written really properly and are well encapsulated. In that case, it's trivial to integrate them. The other times it can be complicated because the third-party library is trying to take over the DOM, do too much, and it's not contained in some portion of the DOM. And the other thing is the modernization observation. Because it's implemented through virtue checking, we need to tell Angular whenever there's a chance that the model changed. And third-party libraries don't know about this. So it's usually easy to just hook into them and just say, okay, if the request from the server came, it modified the model, just tell Angular to do the checking to figure out what changed and update the entire application. So it usually depends on the third-party component, but we try to stay out of the way and be self-contained and not leak somewhere where we should have. But yes, there is also an effort to create a set of components. There's an Angular UI project which tries to create most commonly used widgets that then people just reuse in their applications.
And it does play really well with jQuery.
Yeah. Other questions? Okay.
Any plans for WebSocket support, maybe with data bindings?
Yeah. So WebSockets support, we don't have it out of the box, but it's really trivial to implement it. Another team member on my team, Brian Ford, he blogged about how you can use WebSockets with Angular just about like a week ago or so. So if you go to, it's definitely not Twitter stream and a Google Plus stream. So if you go to Twitter/AngularJS or search for AngularJS on Google Plus, you'll find the blog post there. Or just search for AngularJS and WebSockets, and you should find it on Google.
What about paginating your list?
Pagination. We don't have the pagination facilities out of the box because they typically are application specific unless we tell you, this is how you're going to build the application and that's the only way to build the application. People have built pagination. It's not that difficult to do it once you have the data binding. But it's maybe something that the Angular UI project could tackle and create a reasonable component, or maybe multiple variations of the component so that it's more flexible. Other questions?
Sorry.
Sure, just ask.
Sorry.
Yeah,
what's the difference between the service and the factory in Angular? Because I use them interchangeably, and obviously that's probably not.
Okay. So the way I define the...
Because I saw you did a factory, and I include that in the service.
Right.
Maybe we should have done offline.
So in this case, I'm defining the item component as a factory through the factory function. So the factory function is a function that is injected, and its return value is being used to to cache as the instance in the dependency injector and then distribute throughout the application where it's needed. The service API, so if I replace this with service, in this case, it's going to work. It's going to do the same thing in the end. The difference is that service takes a constructor. So this function is treated as a constructor and is called with new operator on it, and provided all dependencies, so you can dependency inject it. But because of how constructor works in JavaScript, if I remove this return value, the new operator will be called on the function, and the instance that is created by JavaScript is then cached. If you have a return statement in any JavaScript controller, even outside of Angular, the return value is going to be used as the return value from the new operator. So in this case, it's going to do the same thing because of the return, but the difference is factory function versus constructor. So while we are talking about dependency injection, many people are asking me about require.js and dependency injector. Like, why do we invent dependency injection? Why don't we just use require.js? And the answer to that is that they solve two very different problems. Require.js and AMD and CommonJS, they solve the problem of figuring out the code dependencies and figuring out the load order of the code in the browser, either lazily or just concatenate everything at build time and create one file with all the code in the right order. Whereas the dependency injection is all about how to create instances of our components at runtime. So not loading code, but creating instances from the code that was already loaded. And how do we remove global state from our application? And global state is something that makes testing really difficult, because if you have global state, then in every single test that you have, you need to reset the global state, and it's just a mess. Mocking is difficult because you need to monkey patch the global state and clean up after yourself. There are like so many problems that global state causes. Like global state definitely is after mixing the presentation logic with business logic, global state is the second biggest problem. Like testing in JavaScript is really difficult. So dependency injection removes the global state because it creates this service registry, dependency injector, that can be thrown away and recreated between each test. That means that every test will start with a clean state or a well-known state, and there's no chance for one test affecting another test because it mocked some of the global state or anything like that. So that's why dependency injection is so beneficial in large applications where you care about testing. Other questions?
Have you been able to completely remove the need to access DOM from JavaScript, or are there still some areas that need work?
So for small application like the to-do list, we didn't touch DOM at all. We see many applications that are being built without the DOM manipulation at all. The bigger applications, and maybe Lucas can talk a little bit about that. As soon as the application starts growing, you want to take advantage of being able to extend the templating language by creating your components, and that's when you start doing some DOM manipulation. But if the manipulation is contained and you're really creating just small pieces that can then be composed into bigger pieces in the template. So it becomes much easier to do that DOM manipulation and also test it.
Is there a way to replace double curlies?
Yes. Just search Google. People often do it because of collisions with Django. You can do it. No other questions? I think we have some food left over, so feel free to grab more or come over here and talk to me. Thanks for coming. Thank you, Lucas, for organizing this.